scary stories. This happened to me last summer. It was all over the news, and if I gave my name, you would be able to Google me and read my testimony. But for now, I will reserve that info. Last summer, I started seeing this new girl, and she was really sweet and pretty perfect. We went out and partied at the Jersey Shore the night prior to this happening, and we didn't get home until about 3 a.m. When we got home, we had a marathon of sex and didn't fall asleep until about 6:30, 7 a.m. It was such a great night. I was on an adrenaline high. At 11 a.m., she woke up Saturday morning, panicked. She began to scramble and throw on clothes. I asked her what was up. Still laying in bed, she yelled at me, "My parents are coming home at 1 p.m. My house is a mess, and I have to go buy food and alcohol. I need your help. Get dressed." I slowly got up and rubbed my eyes, still feeling very alive from the night before. We both got dressed. Me much calmer than her, and I agreed to drive her to Walmart so she could buy everything she needed for her day with her family. When we got to Walmart, she asked me to just let her out by the front entrance and suggested I just waited in the car, as I was still half asleep and would have just slowed her down. She rushed into the store, and I went to go find a parking spot. The lot was packed, so I had to park far away from the tire shop across the lot. I texted her to let her know when she was coming out so I could pull up and pick her up where I dropped her off. As I sat in my car, slightly daydreaming about the great night I had and fantasizing about the great days to come with my new friend, I closed my eyes and recall beginning to get into a rhythmic breathing pattern that would put even the most alert person into a state of REM sleep. I felt myself doze off, and it was amazing. The air conditioning from my car gently easing me to Z-land. A few minutes later, my heart raced as I suddenly and violently was jolted from my nap. Some very sketchy-looking men stood outside my passenger side, holding a red gas can. The way he knocked on my window jarred me, and I was pissed off. I'm a pretty big guy at 6'5", and this creep was very tall as well, but very grunt and slender, a lanky-looking drifter who was probably the kind of scumbag that would take any drug you put in front of him. He motioned for me to roll my window down and stuttered to me, "Hey, sir, do you think you can help me out? I just need a few bucks for gas. My car ran out." As I mentioned, I was pissed off. He woke me up in such a fashion, so my immediate response was a dismissive and rude, "No, I don't have any fucking cash." The vagrant ignored me. "Sir, please, I'm desperate and stranded." Again, I just said no, dismissing him again, and began to roll up my window. He stuck his free hand on the top of my window glass. "Sir, even the change in the cup holder could help me. Please, I'm in a horrible situation." Realizing this guy wasn't going to leave me alone, I decided to give in and reach into my pants pocket, where I finished out a few singles. Before I gave them to him, my friend texted me, "I'm outside, where are you?" "Parked by the tire shop dealing with a homeless person begging me for money," I responded. I put my phone down and rolled my window down, and it automatically went all the way down. I reached toward the man with $3 in my hand, and what happened next changed my life. In less than a second, I could see he was gearing up to attack me. His face got serious, and he pursed up his lips, gritting his teeth. As he dropped the gas can and reached in with his left hand, lunging for my arm and grabbing it with all the strength in his 140-pound frail body, I tried to pull away and screamed, "Get the hell away from me!" But he had my arm in a vice grip. With his free hand, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out a syringe. which was loaded with God knows what. He turned, freeing my arm up a bit, but it was too late. He had already stuck me with his needle in my arm and pushed down the plunger, releasing whatever it contained into my bloodstream. I again screamed and pulled my arm free. He pulled back and stared into my car, and I screamed at him that I was going to kill him. This made him even more intense, as I remembered him screaming, "Bring it on!" But before I could hear what he said next, I felt my eyes go black and myself lose consciousness. I was out cold. As it turns out, I woke up several hours later in a hospital bed, my friend and my parents and my brother standing over me. They rejoiced as I came to, and my mother called for a doctor and a nurse. I asked what had happened, and my mother told me, "Sweetheart, you were attacked. A deranged maniac stuck you with a paralyzing agent, and you passed out. Jen spotted your car and what was going on. She's the reason you're alive. She saw the man standing around your car and noticed you weren't moving, so she called 911, and luckily there was a police officer down the street that responded, and under 2 minutes Jen screamed out at the man that she sees him, and she called the cops. They were on their way. He jumped into the car and tried pushing you out of the driver's seat, but before he could, the police arrived and took him down with a taser. It turns out that he was homeless, recently released mental patient, and intended to abduct you, and God only knows what he was going to do to you next, but Jen saved your life. What a huge bombshell to drop on someone who just returned to the land of the living. Jen and I are engaged now. We plan to get married. My apartment complex is a nice, well-maintained building surrounded by beaten-down, high-crime neighborhoods. My apartment complex has gates surrounding them that can only be opened by a member or calling a resident and having them manually let you in. But that doesn't mean that it's impossible for trespassers to find their way inside the gates. One night, at about 10 or 11 p.m., I pulled into my apartment after spending time at my fiance's. My roommate had taken the parking spot in front of our building, so I was forced to park off to the side of the building in an uncovered spot. It was a short walk to the apartments, but when I got out of my car, I realized that the lights in front of my apartment building were turned off. The building across from the building still had their front lights on, so I figured that the bulbs were being replaced at 11 p.m. I was lucky that the lights from the other building illuminated parts of the pathway to my apartment, but my anxiety flared up and my imagination began to run wild. I pictured masked murderers jumping from the shadows and whisking me away to a secondary location. My keys found their way between my knuckles as I created a makeshift weapon against the creatures that go bump in the night. I was also wrapped up in my own nightmares as I power walked to my building that I didn't realize someone was standing in front of me until I was almost on top of him. His back was turned towards me, and he had his head down. I thought he was lighting a cigarette, and that was the reason for his strange pose. When I took a step closer, his head flipped around, and he was staring at me as though I was a ghost. He was wide-eyed and looked like an animal caught in a trap facing a hunter. I internally jumped, but I did my best to maintain my composure. My apartment complex is very small, and I had made sure to learn the faces of my neighbors. I didn't recognize this man as living in the complex, and he seemed as though he was homeless. His hair was long and unruly, and he had a beard with bits of matter clinging to the scraggly hair. His clothes were obviously worn, and he was wearing a jacket too big for him and too heavy for the Arizona weather. I continued walking, my grip tightening around the keys in my hand, just in case. I neared the staircase that led to my apartment and turned back when I felt eyes burrowing into me. The man stood there. I had left him a few yards away, but he had twisted his body so that his arms were frozen above his head, and one of his legs looked as though he was about to jump away. The whole contorted look made him look as though he was dancing the running man, but he was completely frozen with his eyes glued to me as I moved for the stairs. We stood staring at each other. He looked like a screenshot of a 90s dancer, and I'm sure I looked like a drowned rat. I squeaked out an apology for interrupting him and ran up the stairs and into my apartment. I stood by my door, looking out the peephole to see if he had followed me, one hand holding my cell phone with 911 ready and the other wrapped around the baseball bat my fiancé had left me after the previous encounter at my complex. Thankfully, he didn't go up the stairs, and as I left with nothing but a bizarre story to retell, I did end up calling the apartment complex's manager, and he informed me that the security officer was on his way to investigate. The story that I am about to tell happened because I guess that I am too nice to people. When I was 17, I was a pretty blonde girl who was very nerdy. I would often get guys who wanted to be more than just friends when they found out I liked games and films, but they always just made their crushes known, and I would gently let them down. I had a high school boyfriend at the time. I worked at a movie theater in the Midwest. I loved this job and became good friends with the people I worked with. It was the perfect job for a teen who loved movies and needed to work after school. That was until I met Simon. Simon was a guy who worked at the theater with me. He seemed nice enough, a little geeky and not very attractive, but kinda just a regular guy, and I was friendly, as I always was. He was almost 10 years older than me, so I wasn't too worried about him thinking I wanted to be more than just friends. As time went on, he gave me more and more attention, talking to me for hours during the downtime when movies were playing. I suspected that he might like me, but I wasn't too worried as he was a manager and I wasn't, and dating between managers and staff was not allowed, so I thought he would just keep it to himself. Then after a year, I was asked to move to another theater as the one I worked at would be shutting down in a few months. I agreed, but I was the only member of the staff to be offered this option. I realize now that this was not as fortuitous as I thought it would be. Just a week after I started at the new theater, Simon showed up to say hi. I was friendly as always and was nice to him. After all, we were the same movie chain, so he would come here to watch movies for free if he wanted to. I thought it was innocent, but soon started to feel uncomfortable with all of the time Simon was spending hanging around at my theater. I asked my coworkers if he came in when I wasn't there, and they said no. Then it dawned on me that we no longer worked at the same theater, so he was free to pursue me romantically without worrying about his job. This made me worry as he started outwardly, if not awkwardly, flirting with me. I found out later that a girl at my job who didn't like me had given Simon a copy of my schedule for the next 2 months, so I started to hide. Every time I saw him, I would make some excuse to go and hide in the stockroom or the projection booth. It was starting to make me very uneasy. My boss, who's still a great friend to me, noticed how uncomfortable I was and told me if I wanted, I could report it to the home office to get him to stop. I thought this was taking it too far, and I declined, thinking eventually that he might give up. Well, he did not. He came in close to my birthday and dropped off a card and a CD with lots of rather creepy music on it. I had finally had enough and told my boss to report him. Management told me he wasn't allowed to come to my theater again, or he would be fired. I didn't see him for a few months. I thought it was over, but then I had people I worked with at the old theater who went to high school with me coming up to me in the halls and cussing me out for getting Simon in trouble. They said that I had led him on and that he was a lonely guy who had a crush, and it was cruel that I got him in trouble or that I wouldn't give him a chance. I was horrified that he had been spreading these rumors to people I thought were my friends and were now attacking me at school. I spent the next few months afraid to go anywhere. I lived in a small town and was terrified of going out in case I ran into him. I am generally a nervous person who scares easily, so my parents thought I was overreacting. My boss told me not to worry and that Simon probably had given up on me. Oh, how I wish that had been true. The day the old theater closed down, I was at work. I had to work late, and me and my boss were the last ones to leave for the night. My boss, Peter, asked me to wait for him so we could lock up together. It was about 2 a.m. once we left. The doors had been locked since 10 p.m. No customers could get in. As we walked out, my boss, who had a kind of sick sense of humor, was joking about Simon and his crush on me, probably trying to make light of it to cheer me up. When we stepped outside, I turned to lock the door, and my boss shouts, "There he is!" I thought he was joking again, and turned to tell him it wasn't funny, but he wasn't joking. Simon was standing there, with just Peter between us. I froze. My entire body went rigid. I didn't know what to do. I heard Simon say my name, and saw he tried to get around my boss, but Peter spread his arms out and blocked him for me. I saw that his eyes were fixed on me. Peter told Simon to get out of here and that I didn't want to see him. I struggled to unlock the door, which was notoriously sticky to get open. I could hear Simon trying to get my attention, but I just focused on the lock. Finally, it gave way, and I rushed inside, running for the office, which had a deadbolt security door. I unlocked it and sat inside, hyperventilating. Peter came in and shut the door, checking I was okay. He told Simon to go home and not to come back, or he would call the cops. We sat in the office and waited for what seemed like forever. Peter then said that he would go and check out to make sure that he had left, and I stayed in the locked office. A few minutes go by, and I hear Peter's voice telling me that he was coming back in. When he opened the door, he looked furious and headed straight for the phone. I asked what was going on, and he said that Simon was still out there. Apparently, he had parked in the shadow of the theater where it is hard to see. He parked in such a way that I would have had to walk past him to get into my car. He had parked his van, a van I didn't know he had in the shadows. Peter had found him crouched down beside the van, as if waiting for something, waiting for me to walk by. Peter had shouted he was calling the cops and ran back inside. By the time the cops showed up, he had left. They took a statement, and Peter told them all Simon's contact information, as he was still in the system. We guessed he showed up today because he is no longer at risk of losing his job, as the theater had closed down. I never saw Simon again, but that doesn't mean that I wasn't terrified that I might run into him again. I spent the whole year until I moved away terrified I might run into him again. I never did, but it did ruin what should have been a great summer before I left for college. I hate to think what would have happened if my boss hadn't been there that night, or hadn't been smart enough to check that Simon had left. I am still good friends with Peter. He even came to my wedding. I owe him an unknown debt, and to Simon, wherever you are, let's not meet again.